All right, well, welcome back, everyone. Here we are, the end of the week. It's going to be a rough week ahead again. Um, yeah, we'll just muddle through. So, just a few announcements. First of all, um, we're finishing up the book Connected, which means that after that you don't need to post and packback. The packback is finished. However, if over the last few weeks you missed a post, your life was chaotic and you didn't read a chapter in time, or didn't make it to packback, feel free to post. Also, feel free to keep on posting about COVID-19 or the economy or what's going on in the world. It might be a good place to have it used as a forum for discussion, if you want to. If you want a place to discuss things with your peers in a more sort of academic sort of way. If you do, try and connect it to sociology, if possible. Okay, other news. So the TAs and I are going to be grading the papers. Remember, the TAs are also undergraduates. They're also, their lives have been upended like yours have. So, I've given them basically till the end of the semester to finish the grading. So, if you have any feedback, once those are graded and you have questions, you can just direct those to me because I'll be available. Okay. I do like that I can drink my tea while sitting down and lecturing. That's about all I like. I miss everything else about the classroom. Okay. Other big news. So a week from today is the next exam. I'll be posting the study guide for that. It will cover just chapters 13 and 14, the one on government and politics, and the one this week on the economy and employment. It will be similar to the last exam. You can have all day to take it, any time during the day. You'll have 2 hours to complete it. Open note, open book, that sort of thing. As I said, the study guide will be posted today. I'll be lecturing on chapter 18 on sexuality and health next week, but that stuff won't be on the exam. So it'll just be the stuff from last week on the government and this week on the economy. Okay, so we left off last time talking about this. I was saying America has this huge corporate debt bubble that may burst. We had this huge corporate debt bubble, meaning that a lot of corporations were thriving on debt rather than a lot of actual profit or revenue. Now, it's hard to say what's going to happen with a big government bailout. You see that basically, though, corporate debt tends to spike before a recession. So, I knew a recession was going to come at some point in the next couple of years, for some reason, just because of the corporate debt and other things going on, and we tend to see recessions every 10 years or so. So a recession was, more than likely going to happen. It's just that we did not expect it to, take the form that it did, or to be as crushing as we're seeing it right now. So figures came out since the other day, since Wednesday, since I gave the lecture Wednesday. So right now, unemployment in the United States is at 13%. So if you remember, the highest it got during the last recession 10 years ago was about it was 8%. I'm sorry, no. Was 10%. It was 8 million unemployed at 10%. Now we have 13% unemployment, and that's probably going to go higher over the coming months ahead. Even with this economic stimulus and all this money rushing in, maybe mask factories, ventilator factories will open up and need employment. but at the same time, you're still probably going to see a lot of jobs being cut, which is, is going to be devastating. We're going to see, I'm expecting cuts at the university. I'm crossing my fingers about my own job. But yeah, it's going to be hard. There's going to be a lot of hardship across the country and across the world over the coming months ahead. Okay, now I want to kind of talk about just some kind of basic stuff about capitalism itself, different ways of thinking about it. So, if you remember, Marx kind of talked about capitalism in the sense of, it was this economic system that accumulates capital, that accumulates money, and so on. Adam Smith saw it as this way in which to allocate resources based upon supply and demand. And Joseph Schumpeter kind of said, it's kind of a bit of both of those. But it's also there's something else going on. And he really stressed this idea of entrepreneurialism and innovation. And, his conception of the entrepreneur was not just someone who starts a business, as we kind of usually think of it, but rather someone who really kind of innovates a new way of doing things, who really disrupts traditional ways of business. Traditional ways of doing things. And he called this creative destruction. And he said that really this is, in some ways the engine of capitalism, this creative destruction. So capitalism is constantly just disrupting old ways of doing things. And this is something that a lot of people who say they're in favor of capitalism often don't understand. When they're threatened by creative destruction itself, then they, say that maybe it's, the role of the government or something like this. But capitalism thrives on destruction and constant disruption. And this has been sort of the mantra of Silicon Valley over the last, 15, 20 years especially. Move fast and break things. This idea, we're going to be disrupting everything, disrupting old ways of doing business and so on and so forth. Zoom is, could say that they're disrupting education by, making everything, via synchronous learning, via satellite and so on. At the same time, I'll kind of talk about some of the limitations of creative destruction. But creative destruction has been sort of a mantra, especially in the age of the internet, where you do see a lot of digital disruption happening, and it's following this sort of idea of creative destruction. Now, what we tend to see, though, after enough creative destruction, is that companies themselves, who at one time were creatively destroying things, often tend to start to, take over markets. And once a single firm becomes sort of dominant within an industry, it becomes a monopoly. So one of the major monopolies today that we see and monopoly fights that we see is Google and the European Union. So Google, is accused of being in a monopoly when it comes to search engines, and is in a series of court battles with the European Union right now. There's, a lot more I could say about monopolies. I think I'll save some of this until we move on a little bit. Some changes that we see in the global economy, or some changes that have happened. So capitalism 100 years ago, the capitalism that Henry Ford of Ford Motor Company was involved in, now we call this model Fordism. So you had this type of capitalism that was where you had mass production happening in factories. A lot of it was happening in-house, locally. A lot of the workers had high job security. They had high wages, things like this. There was a lot of career advancement for them, things like that. And now, since the 1970s, and since this age of globalization, we've moved into an era of post-Fordism. So instead of, mass production all happening in one factory, cars being manufactured in Detroit, Michigan. You have different parts of automobiles being, manufactured around the world. And maybe it all comes together in a single factory in Detroit, or something like that. So in some ways, we've talked about this, you can get goods for much cheaper in a global economy. At the same time, there's a lot more job insecurity. There's lower wages, a lot more short-term and part-time work, and so on and so forth. We also see challenges. COVID-19 is showing some of the challenges that this model faces. When you see supply chains being spread out across the globe right now, as supply chains are disrupted, that's becoming potentially problematic. So just looking at Henry Ford here, and just kind of an example, you got the automobile all being developed within the factory itself. We've got the body here, the tires, and so on and so forth. So production was in-house; it was not outsourced. Today, with globalization, we see lower costs. So this is a or less globalized world. At the same time, you also saw a guy named Henry Winslow Taylor develop something we call scientific management. That's pretty standard today, sometimes called Taylorism. Taylorism and scientific management for the exam. Scientific management, again, this set of ideas that were developed, kind of like this guy here who's looking at these workers, kind of monitoring what they're doing. Scientific management is just basically trying to figure out more efficient ways in which to do things, in which to carry out tasks at the workplace. Kind of talked about Fordism already. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but just kind of pointing out that this is the time when, it kind of coincides with globalization, the rise of technology, the rise of computer technology in particular, and the digital economy. So again, just kind of stressing, post-Fordism itself is sort of in crisis from COVID-19. And even if in, say, in a year or 2 years, we find a vaccine for COVID-19, nevertheless, it's raised a series of challenges that, now we know that there are these challenges with a global economy. So this will inevitably going to affect how supply chains operate in ways that we just don't know yet. So anyway, these slides are to be written, so to speak. All right, I'm going to talk about these 3 different types of capitalism. These are in the slides, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this individual slide here right now. So I'm going to spend most of my time on these 3 that I had planned to talk about already, but I do want to point out that we see 2, I would say at least 2 different types of capitalism potentially emerging, and there's maybe even more than that. So what I definitely see is a different types of state capitalism emerging. Now, some people have said that these already exist in China, in Russia, in other places. People have been talking about this for years. Now, I would say that in different forms, we see these in the United States, and to a much stronger degree in European countries and East Asian and other countries around the world, where governments are now getting directly involved in the marketplace. So, we're probably going to see governments get involved to make sure that their grocery stores are stocked up. Make sure that there might be certain goods like toilet paper and food in grocery stores. We're probably going to see more stricter trade controls, things like that, healthcare, vaccination, things like this. So, I don't think we're going to see the sort of 20, and I'm pretty, almost 100% sure that we're not going to see the sort of 20th century socialism that we saw in the past, but we're also not going to see the free market capitalism that we saw of the last few decades. We've potentially entered a new area of state capitalism where there's much more government involvement. And that can be state as in unaccountable government or state as in, representative democracy. Again, it just kind of depends on what we as people decide to do. Also, though, I think over time, and perhaps potentially, if we don't go in, say, the route of state capitalism, we could see anarcho-capitalism. So anarcho-capitalism here referring to extreme decentralization, where actually governments are not so much involved, where actually, you have less involvement, more competition, and potentially more anarchy. Anarcho-capitalism, this is sort of, it's a kind of a libertarian ideal, at least the way that it's been written about. I think you could see it in reality in certain countries around the world that don't have strong functioning governments, where you do have something akin to actual free markets. Again, this is sort of theoretical at this point. This is something that I think we may see in the future, or maybe see emerging already in the present. Okay, but to the types of capitalism that have sort of existed already and are, kind of still in existence at the moment, one, we see welfare capitalism. Now, this is, we could say that this is sort of a state capitalism light. Basically, this is, what we see in Western European countries, and importantly in the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries. So here you have companies who work with the state, and the state is involved to make sure that that employees are protected from market declines. And we actually see a big difference in terms of the way that some European countries are doing their stimulus and the way that the United States is doing its stimulus. So, for example, Denmark is basically, they're nationalizing payments. So they are basically protecting businesses, and so by preventing layoffs. And so they're funding the payment system, so workers are kind of like on a paid vacation for a little while. And then so the idea being that once you start to open up the economy again, people can go back into their old jobs more easily. Interestingly, that's not being done in the United States. Britain is doing this as well. So Britain, which used to not have so much of this, is moving in this direction. So the United States and Britain in the past, at least a few weeks ago, had a more what we would call institutional capitalist model, where it emphasizes the shareholders over customers, where shareholders are the basis of it. Public companies where you have where shareholders are really driving capitalism, and the idea was that it would surpass other forms of capitalism, such as family capitalism, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the welfare capitalism that I just mentioned. So this is the type of capitalism. Institutional capitalism has been dominant on Wall Street. A fantastic book that I've been reading, and unfortunately wasn't able to include into this lecture material, but I'm going to in future, is this book called, I'm trying to see it, Radical Markets. So it's called Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society by Eric Posner and Glenn Weil. So they argue that a lot of these big institutional investors are actually kind of problematic for Wall Street, because in the big investors, where am I going with this? Okay, the big investors right now are these huge companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, others that I'm blanking on for some reason. And so they're investing in, the problem with these big companies is that they end up investing in a lot of different companies within the same industry. So they'll be invested in both Ford and GM. And what they end up doing, and what they argue in this book, Radical Markets, is that they end up actually reducing competition. That it's actually anti-competitive, and that actually leads to less innovation. It actually leads to wage stagnation, pushes down wages and things like this, and pushes up prices. So it's actually a really bad thing. Not that there are institutional investors, these big institutional investors, but rather that they control so much of the market and are invested in so many big companies within industries, within single industries, and so on. So their idea is that, you kind of break that system up a bit, and you're trying to have individual investors be more important. Big pension funds are involved in individual investors. So we also have activist investors, sort of, these are individuals as well as hedge funds and other organizations that are trying to more actively not activist in the sense of political activists, but more activists in the sense of they're actively trying to influence how companies are operating. Wall Street is often, painted for its greed, as the movie Wall Street famously pointed out. It's also a place where we see, investment and innovation get funded. Right now, it's so hard to know what exactly is going on with Wall Street. I do want to just wanted to say that when we talk about activist investors, probably the best known one is Carl Icahn. He's known for trying to influence companies like Apple and other companies with their tweets and so on and so forth. I do want to just kind of go back here to just the Wall Street slide, so I can just kind of get you to think about it for a second. So what we see happening right now, and with this huge stimulus package that is very hard to understand, it's very complex, and I'm not going to pretend that I understand a lot of it, but I do want to point out some big problems I see with it. So one of the big areas the biggest sector that needs help right now are small businesses. This employs actually a lot of Americans. A lot of small restaurants that are being hit really hard. Just a whole range of small businesses. And so small businesses are being loaned money. So remember when I talked about the ways in which Denmark and welfare capitalist countries are managing their stimulus. They're trying to protect the businesses themselves by funding by basically socializing the payment system, by paying the workers their wages until the economy opens back up, and so that they can get the same jobs. In America, we're not doing that. We're expanding unemployment insurance, and we're expanding small business insurance, small business loans. So right now you have a lot of people who are applying for unemployment, and you have a lot of small businesses who are applying for small business loans. So there's already a lot of articles about the problems with the way this is being done. I have a friend who's friends at both ends of it. One who's working on securing small business loans for a lot of small businesses that they insure. Another who works for a big bank and works on trying to get loans to those small businesses. And so they're both having troubles. One's working on the applications right now. The other's trying to figure out how they are going to provide loans for the small businesses. And it looks like the small business loan program was badly thought out, that trying to make it go through the financial institutions was a bad idea. that is going to be clogged, the system's going to be clogged, and people aren't going to get their loan for a long time. It's going to be a mess. I'm hearing that it's going to be a real nightmare. So what we're going to need to do is probably move toward a system like we see that they're doing in some European countries, but we've already lost a lot of time and potentially wasted a lot of money and energy, and I don't know. Anyway, I hope we can fix this in the coming weeks ahead, because we've got a mess on our hands. Okay. The last type of capitalism I'll discuss, family capitalism. So this is the most dominant type. But a lot of family capitalists are sort of reliant upon the state right now for funding and things like that. But this is the vast majority of the world's companies, about a third of the companies in the United States, and so on. We tend to see that these are, the majority of companies in some parts of the world, or huge portions of some of companies in parts of Asia in particular, and that's why family capitalism is probably going to stay. So a number of books and economists and so on for a number of years, a famous book by Adolf Berle and Gardner Means back in 1932-33. I think it was actually 33. It was written called The Modern Corporation and the Private Party. And so what they were doing there was saying that, this model of shareholding capitalism, institutional capitalism, is going to, just kind of brush away this old family capitalist model. And we saw this was kind of happening in both Britain and the United States. And, for the most part, has pretty much remained an Anglo-Saxon thing. Family capitalism has remained fairly strong across the rest of the world. We see here as an example, some of these businesses are very old. So Antinori, this wine business in Tuscany in Italy, which I would love to go to right now. Imagine myself drinking wine and Italian and some Italian, I don't know, olive grove or something. Anyway, this business has been around since the 1300s, so that's a long-lasting business, a long-lasting family business. You might know this little business, or at least then, excuse me. At least back then, it was kind of little. It was known as Walton's. Back in Bentonville, Arkansas. They just sold some convenience store items, appliances, stuff like that. Well, today they've turned into this gigantic, behemoth Walmart, and have destroyed all these other, the other future wanting, mom and pop shops that wanted to be, Walmart or, remain in business at least or something like that. So Walmart turned into this, enormous company that spread across the world, specializing in everything from everything to everything, and is now, going global, and not just going global, but also going online. And now is actually one of the few stores that is open around, especially if they're selling, excuse me, if they're selling, food and grocery items and things like that. So as I said, the world had already been moving in some ways toward a sort of state capitalist model. This article came out in 2012, and they were primarily talking about countries like China and Russia and other places where you saw, Turkey, for example, places where you saw market economies and capitalist organizations, but you also saw a very strong state, and the state kind of guiding industry. And now we're seeing that globally. We're seeing that in the United States and everywhere, and it's unclear where that goes and how the states, and if I'm saying, it's my view that, the state's going to be heavily involved in the economy for quite some time. It always has been. I think the idea of the free market detached from any sort of state was always kind of a fantasy, kind of like, a socialist economy where everybody gets together. There's no market and no inequality. That's kind of a fantasy too. So, we should maybe, expand our minds when it comes to economic thinking, and recognize probably we're going to, have a interesting puzzles of the state and the market, to get us through. So Walmart itself, one reason it grew was it took advantage of China, and China took advantage of Walmart. The rise of China as an economic power, was hand in hand with the rise of Walmart. Now, it's not saying that they couldn't have done it otherwise, but they had a huge role. They had a huge role in each other's economic development. So I think even as we see state capitalism rise, I think we're still going to see family capitalism stay. Family capital businesses are getting better at management. You also see Asia as the center of economic activity, or turning into the center of economic activity. And we see a lot of family businesses that are being funded by the state. So we may actually see some sort of weird combination of state and family businesses, which actually, I say weird for the United States and European economies, perhaps not so weird for parts of Asia that have already had some of these systems in place. And these are the parts of Asia that, in particular, South Asia too, and parts of the Middle East too are sort of using this model. So we're actually going to see. I would say that within the next 20 to 30, 50 years, new models of the economy may develop, and they're probably going to be, types of capitalism heavily influenced by developments in the eastern part of Asia. Samsung, huge company, also a family business. You can see some of these other major businesses, chaebols in South Korea that have, that are for the most part family businesses. Okay, talking about workers, what do workers want? Well, workers want to be paid, more job satisfaction, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this, but you notice some of these differences between what workers and students, how important they see some of these things for their happiness. I want to just point out some of the differences. Prestige, wealth, community leadership. Why such a big difference in those areas? Well, basically, when you're a student, you've still got the world ahead of you. Once you get into the world of work, then, you don't care about prestige as much. The horizons of wealth start to narrow for the most part, meaning that, once you enter a certain field, you kind of know, what the high-end earnings you're going to get are going to be, that sort of thing. Community leadership, maybe this is something you really wanted to do when you were a student, and then you get into the world of work and you've got kids and so on and so forth. Or in my case, you've got 3 cats, and oh my goodness, my wife and I and our 3 cats, and how can we get involved in community leadership when we've got to figure out how to raise these 3 cats, that sort of thing. So anyway, just life happens. It happens more as you enter the world of work. Okay, automation. So this is something that, I would say is going to pick up steam even more than it already was. More and more jobs are going to be automated. And you can, think about this, and, maybe if you want to talk about something on PackBack, do you think automation is going to make things better or worse? Again, you don't have to talk about anything on PackBack, but, if you want to, this is perhaps a subject of discussion. Marx always pointed out that, automation was was for the most part a good thing. If you can make machines do hard work, that you're saving that hard work for, you're saving humans from having to do that sort of hard work. The problem is, what if companies everywhere start doing that? And what's going to happen to the workforce? What's going to happen to consumers? Where's your demand going to come from? Looking at the probability of certain jobs being lost. So these jobs are more likely to be lost. These jobs are less likely to be lost. I'm just going to kind of go through these quickly. The main thing I want you to recognize is here up at the top, those less likely to be jobs: recreational therapists, dentists, trainers, clergy, chemical engineers, but especially these ones. Think about those. Think about these: retail salespeople, accountants, telemarketers. Why would they be automated? Here you've got almost no chance of being automated: oral surgeons, healthcare social workers, occupational therapists, and so on. And up here you got telemarketers and technicians, data entry people, and so on. Well, people who can work directly with other people are less likely to be automated. Now, some of this may change as a result of coronavirus. People who work with other people are, you face some challenges. Except you still need people like that in the healthcare sector. So the healthcare sector is still going to see a lot of demand. It'll be a while before we see robots being able to give a good massage. But we see a lot of money going into artificial intelligence. So, I would say that we're going to see, the rise of these systems continue in the coming years. We also see that companies like Walmart are facing competition from Amazon. Amazon is one of the few companies. They're taking a hit, but they're still operating unlike many other companies right now. Walmart is as well. So both of those companies, a lot of the large companies are doing better than the smaller ones right now. But the trend has been toward automation. So Amazon itself, that in this row of blue, and they almost look like the little robot vacuum cleaners, but these are actually robots that carry goods around Amazon warehouses. And they can be used they're controlled through GPS. So you actually only need like two or three people in the warehouse just monitoring the computer system. So labor unions are changing in America. Union density is the number of union members as a percentage of the number of people who could be a member of a union within a certain industry. So work stoppages is a word for strike. So unions form to advocate for greater wages, better healthcare plan, better hours, something like this. So labor union activity in the United States was really high early on in American history and early on in the 20th century, and began falling during the 1970s and 80s. Well, what's going on right here? Globalization. Again, you have jobs being moved, factories being moved overseas, and it just crushes the labor movement in the United States and in other rich countries that are engaged in outsourcing. Today, we see most union activity happening in public administration and education, things like this. You can look at that chart in the slides. I think this is kind of interesting. So a lot of the labor union activity in the past had been in the private sector, and that fell because you outsource, in terms of the percentages, you outsource private work, but you can't as easily outsource public jobs. You can't easily outsource city planners or city municipal workers, people who work on maintenance of the sewer system, things like that. So those can be unionized, and those workers can more easily and effectively fight for higher pay and stuff like that. The unions, fall into the classic free rider problem. So those who receive economic benefits who do not pay for them. So there are a lot of people who do not pay for union benefits. But if the union successfully advocates for higher pay, then they still get that higher pay, even though they didn't pay for the union benefits, they didn't, take part in the strike or something like that. At the same time, though, workers may not want to join a union because perhaps a union will be advocating for something, and that will cause a company to then go and outsource. So again, it's a complex balance, I would say. What we have are right-to-work laws. So right-to-work laws are where workers don't have to join a union as part of their employment. So in some states, unions have lobbied successfully for companies to require that workers had to join a union in order for that to happen. So you see in primarily the South and a few Western states, primarily Republican states, you don't have right-to-work laws because you generally have a higher union activity in some of those other states. So the big shift that's happening that we don't really have a lot of time to talk about in this class, but in economic sociology right now, the big shift is a shift from understanding institutions to understanding networks. But you're actually ahead of a lot of economic sociologists or old school economic sociologists because you've been reading Connected and you've been thinking about social networks this whole semester. So use your social networks. I was going to say something, answer these questions. These are just a couple of questions you might sort of see somewhere, the type of questions you may see on the exam, that sort of thing. These are in the slides. But as I was going to say, use your social networks to help you find a job or to, just maintain, your stability, your sanity, your connections for your own mental health and personal health, and hopefully, we can get through this and, in a few years or a few months even, hopefully some of you can get jobs and not fall behind too much in the labor force. All right, hang in there, everyone. Have a good weekend.